The sit-up mat is unrolled on the bedroom floor. You're on your back. Knees bent, feet hooked under the dresser. First rep. The trunk curls upward. The burn arrives in the abdomen. The assumption, the burn means the right muscles are working and the back is being protected. 50 reps before breakfast. For the core. For the back. For the discipline. Each repetition generates approximately 3,400 newtons of compressive force on the lumbar spine, roughly equivalent to placing a 340 kilogram weight on top of the lumbar vertebral column and compressing it downward. The National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health sets the action limit for spinal compression at 3,300 newtons, the threshold above which an industrial worker is considered at risk for cumulative disc injury and would be reassigned or the task redesigned. Every sit-up exceeds it by 100 newtons. The factory worker who loaded their spine to 3,400 newtons repeatedly would be pulled off the line. You do it 50 times before breakfast. The comparison is not rhetorical. The NIOSH action limit exists because decades of occupational injury data establish that workers who repeatedly load their spines above 3,300 newtons develop disc injuries at rates that exceed acceptable risk. The threshold is evidence-based, derived from injury surveillance across millions of worker years. The sit-up exceeds this threshold on every repetition, generating 100 newtons above the limit. An industrial hygienist would flag for immediate task redesign. A warehouse worker lifting boxes that generate 3,400 newtons of spinal compression would trigger a mandatory ergonomic intervention. The task would be redesigned, the load reduced, or the worker rotated to a different station. The assessment would not wait for an injury. The threshold exists to prevent injuries before they occur. The sit-up generates the same force on the same structure under the same biomechanical principles, but no threshold assessment exists for voluntary exercise because the occupational and recreational domains do not share a regulatory framework. The spine does not distinguish between occupational and recreational loading. The disc does not know whether the 3,400 newtons came from lifting a box or performing a sit-up. The annular fibers experience the same stress, the same deformation, the same fatigue accumulation regardless of the context in which the force was applied. The regulatory distinction between workplace and gym does not exist at the tissue level. The exercise you perform to protect the back applies the same compressive force that occupational safety regulations exist to prevent in the workplace. The irony is structural. The exercise chosen to protect the back applies the force that damages it through a mechanism the exercise was never designed to avoid because the force measurement was not available when the exercise became standard training. The force comes from a hip flexor anchored to the lumbar vertebrae. The loading pattern matches the mechanism that herniates discs. The U.S. military measured the injury rate and removed the exercise in 2021, and the replacement produces the same abdominal activation at half the spinal compression. 5 physics problems in one exercise. One measurement changes everything. Where does the 3,400 newtons come from? Stuart McGill, professor of spine biomechanics at the University of Waterloo, measured this force across 30 years of spinal loading research using intradiscal pressure transducers and biomechanical modeling. The measurement is specific. Approximately 3,400 newtons, 340 kilogram force, of compression on the L4-L5 disc at peak sit-up motion. Force originates from the psoas major, a muscle most people have never heard of and fewer have seen on an anatomy diagram, generating the force most people attribute to the abdominals. The psoas originates from the transverse processes and vertebral bodies of T12 through L5, 5 lumbar vertebrae, and the lowest thoracic vertebra. It crosses the pelvis and inserts on the lesser trochanter of the femur, the inner upper thigh. When the psoas contracts during a sit-up, it pulls the lumbar vertebrae downward and forward toward the femur. The compression on the disc is the psoas pulling. The vertebrae above are pulled toward the vertebrae below through the muscle's contraction, and the disc between them absorbs the compressive force the contraction generates. The disc is a hydraulic cushion. The nucleus pulposus is 70 to 80% water under pressure, contained by the annular fibers arranged in concentric laminated layers like the plies of a radial tire. Each layer runs at a different angle to the adjacent layer, creating a crosshatch pattern that distributes stress in multiple directions. Under axial compression, the nucleus pressurizes uniformly, and the annular layers absorb the pressure through hoop stress distributed across the crosshatch. Under combined flexion and compression, the stress distribution shifts. The posterior layers bear disproportionate load as the nucleus pushes toward the back of the disc. The loading is axial. The force vector runs along the spinal column, compressing the disc from above and below simultaneously, squeezing the nucleus under Pascal's law the way a hydraulic press squeezes fluid between two plates. The harder the psoas contracts, the tighter the press closes, and the more the nucleus pressurizes against the annular wall that contains it. Psoas uses the lumbar spine as its anchor point. Every newton of force the psoas generates to lift the trunk is transmitted through the lumbar vertebrae as compression on the intervertebral discs. The harder the psoas pulls, the more the discs compress. At 3,400 newtons, the compression exceeds the threshold that industrial safety regulations consider unsafe for a worker performing the task 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. The threshold was not set arbitrarily. It was derived from decades of epidemiological data correlating spinal compression levels with disc injury rates across industrial populations, and it represents the force level above which cumulative injury risk rises to unacceptable levels regardless of the number of repetitions. Spinal compression during sit-ups follows this force pattern through measurable intradiscal pressure data. Sit-up compressive loads on the lumbar spine consistently exceed the NIOSH action limit. McGill measured these forces in low back disorders. I experienced the NIOSH comparison differently the week the force measurement replaced the word core in my understanding of my morning sit-up routine. 3,400 newtons, 100 above the safety threshold, 50 times every morning. For 20 years, the factory worker would have been reassigned. I added a set. Now the force is measured. The threshold is exceeded. The question is, what 3,400 newtons of compressive force does to the disc during each repetition, and whether the loading pattern matches the mechanism that herniates them. What does the sit-up do to the disc? Disc herniation discussion described the mechanism during spinal flexion. The anterior annulus compresses, the posterior annulus stretches, and the nucleus, a pressurized gel under Pascal's law, shifts posteriorly toward the weakest point of the annular wall, the posterior lateral margin where the wall is thinnest, and the posterior longitudinal ligament narrows. Each sit-up recreates this displacement. The trunk flexes. The lumbar spine bends forward under 3,400 newtons of psoas-generated compression. The nucleus shifts posteriorly. The posterior annular fibers stretch under combined flexion and compression. 1 rep, 1 posterior nucleus migration at forces exceeding the industrial safety threshold. 50 reps, 50 posterior migrations at the per rep force before breakfast. Pascal's law ensures the pressure distributes uniformly throughout the nucleus, and the nucleus pushes outward against the annular wall at every point simultaneously. But the posterior wall is the thinnest, approximately 1.5 millimeters compared to approximately 3 millimeters anteriorly, and the posterior longitudinal ligament that reinforces the wall narrows at L4, L5, and L5 zone, the two segments that bear the highest proportion of the sit-up's compressive force. The weakest point of the wall sits at the segment bearing the highest load. The geometry concentrates the failure risk at the exact location the nucleus pushes hardest during flexion. Annular fibers at the posterior margin experience fatigue loading through Paris law crack propagation, where each cycle advances existing microdamage by increments too small to feel. 50 repetitions per day, 365 days per year, 10 years, 182,500 high-force flexion cycles on the posterior annulus, each cycle individually survivable. The annular collagen fibers that resist the posterior bulge operate under the same fatigue mechanics every structural material obeys. The failure threshold for a single cycle is far above the load any single sit-up applies, but the failure threshold for 182,000 cycles is far below it because fatigue damage accumulates with each cycle regardless of whether the single cycle threshold is exceeded. The cumulative damage is the failure mechanism. The same principle the aircraft wing inspection schedule was designed to detect before the wing reaches its fatigue limit. The accumulated damage propagating through the laminated collagen layers of the annular wall at rates proportional to the force magnitude and the cycle count. Cadaveric disc testing under this loading pattern produces measurable annular delamination at approximately 5,000 to 10,000 cycles. At 50 repetitions per day, the arithmetic reaches the lower end of that range in 100 days, approximately 3 months of daily sit-ups. The first measurable delamination, the first separation between annular laminae that a dissection would reveal, begins within months of starting the exercise. The damage that eventually permits nucleus extrusion through the posterior wall accumulates across years of continued loading, each day adding its 50 cycles to a process that became structurally detectable within the first season. The herniation at 55 loaded the failure mechanism 182,500 times, far beyond the range where cadaver testing shows structural failure. You felt nothing during the accumulation. The annular damage propagated below the threshold of sensation, each microcrack too small to produce pain, the wall maintaining its structural integrity until the accumulated damage reached the point where the nucleus pushed through. The herniation appeared sudden. The morning you could not stand straight, the moment the pain radiated down the leg. The emergency that seemed to arrive without warning was the endpoint of a fatigue process that had been running below the pain threshold for years or decades, loaded repeatedly by an exercise performed in good faith to prevent exactly the injury it was producing. The damage was 2 decades in the making, loaded 50 times every morning by an exercise you believed was protecting the structure it was progressively weakening. Repeated flexion cycles at physiological loads produce progressive annular delamination, culminating in nucleus extrusion through the posterior wall, a relationship established through decades of biomechanical testing. Force exceeds the safety threshold. The loading pattern matches the herniation mechanism, and the muscle generating that force is the muscle you never intended to train. Why is the psoas doing the work instead of the abs? Electromyography studies from the McGill laboratory tell the story in activation percentages. During a full sit-up from floor to knees, the rectus abdominis, the muscle the exercise is supposed to train, is maximally active during the first 30 degrees of trunk flexion, the initial curl where the shoulders leave the floor. This first 30 degrees generates approximately 1,400 to 1,800 newtons of lumbar compression, below the NIOSH threshold, because the moment arm between the trunk center of mass and the lumbar fulcrum is shortest at this angle. Beyond 30 degrees, the psoas takes over. The hip flexion that lifts the trunk from 30 to 90 degrees is primarily psoas driven. The rectus abdominis activity plateaus while the psoas force climbs. The compression rises from 1,800 to 3,400 newtons as the moment arm lengthens and the psoas pulls harder against its lumbar anchor to complete the movement. 70% of the sit-up's range of motion trains the psoas. The abdominals, the intended target, are maximally trained in the first 30% of the range, the curl portion, at forces below the safety threshold. The portion generating the dangerous compression trains a hip flexor you never intended to strengthen, using the lumbar spine as the anchor point you never knew the muscle was attached to. Psoas and rectus abdominis. Activation patterns during sit-ups follow this EMG profile through measurable electrode data. Psoas contribution dominates the hip flexion phase while rectus abdominis contribution peaks during the initial trunk curl. Juker and colleagues documented these activation patterns in clinical biomechanics. Well, the psoas revelation reframed the burn I had been interpreting as abdominal work. The burn in the first 30 degrees was the rectus. The strain beyond 30 degrees, the portion that felt like the hardest work, the part you pushed through because harder meant better, was the psoas using your lumbar vertebrae as a fulcrum to lift your trunk. The portion of the exercise that felt most productive was the portion producing the most spinal compression with the least abdominal contribution. The effort beyond 30 degrees, the portion I pushed through because it felt like I was working harder, was the psoas compressing my lumbar discs at the per rep compression, while the rectus contributed progressively less to the movement. The harder I pushed, the more the psoas pulled, the more the discs compressed, and the less the abdominals contributed. The effort and the benefit were inversely correlated beyond 30 degrees. Force is measured. The mechanism is identified. The wrong muscle is doing the work. The failure analysis has established the load, the threshold, the mechanism, and the muscle. The question remaining is whether this analysis exists only in a biomechanics laboratory, or whether an institution with millions of participants and decades of injury data reached the same conclusion. Did anyone with large-scale data act on this physics? United States Army removed the sit-up from the Army Combat Fitness Test in 2021, replacing it with the plank. The Canadian Armed Forces followed. Multiple military organizations worldwide removed or replaced the sit-up based on the same injury data. Institutional assessment was specific. Sit-ups were the single highest contributor to training-related lower back injuries across military populations. Millions of service members performing the exercise under standardized conditions across decades. The injury rate exceeded the training value. The data was unambiguous. Across populations large enough to eliminate individual variation, the sit-up produced more lower back injuries than any other single exercise in the military fitness program. The decision was actuarial. The cost of treating the injuries exceeded the benefit of the training the exercise provided. The medical discharge rate for lower back injuries in military populations running sit-up-based fitness tests was measurably higher than in populations using alternative assessments. The data spanned decades and millions of service members, sample sizes large enough to establish causation beyond correlation. The sit-up caused injuries at rates the training benefit could not justify. The military examined the same physics McGill had measured in the laboratory and reached the operational conclusion: the exercise damages more spines than it strengthens cores. The cost-benefit analysis showed the spine absorbed more damage than the core gained strength. Plank replacement, isometric core activation without spinal flexion. The core holds position against gravity. Anti-movement training which matches the spine's actual engineering requirement. The back pain discussion described the core as a guy wire system, muscles pulling in coordinated tension to stiffen a flexible rod. Guy wires resist movement, they do not produce it. A telephone pole with guy wires stands stable because the wires pull in opposite directions, creating tension that prevents the pole from moving in any direction. Cut one wire and the pole falls toward the unsupported side. The core muscles operate identically. The rectus resists extension, the obliques resist rotation, the multifidus resists flexion. All three muscle groups pulling against each other to create the stiffness that prevents the spinal column from buckling under load. The military moved from training core flexion to training core stability, from producing movement to resisting movement, because the spine's engineering requires resistance and the sit-up train production. The plank generates approximately 1,000 to 1,200 newtons of lumbar compression, well below the NIOSH threshold, while producing comparable core activation through isometric contraction. The spine stays neutral. The nucleus stays centered. The annulus bears no flexion-driven posterior loading. The core trains at force levels the disc can sustain indefinitely, because the loading pattern avoids the failure mechanism entirely. Now, the military replaced the exercise with the plank. McGill designed a more specific alternative, one that preserved the abdominal training while eliminating the loading mechanism the spine cannot tolerate. What is the McGill curl-up, and why does it work where the sit-up fails? Supine position. One knee bent, one leg straight. Hands placed under the lumbar spine to maintain natural lordosis. The hand position is engineering. The hands prevent the lumbar spine from flattening into the floor during the curl, maintaining the natural lordotic curve that keeps the nucleus centered in the disc. Without the hands, the lower back presses flat, the lumbar spine flexes, and the nucleus shifts posteriorly, recreating the loading pattern the curl-up was designed to avoid. The hands are a mechanical stop preventing the movement the exercise must exclude. Head and shoulders lift approximately 2 to 3 centimeters off the floor, the first 15 to 20 degrees of trunk flexion only. Hold for 10 seconds. The sustained isometric contraction recruits slow-twitch type 1 motor units, the fatigue-resistant fibers that match the core's stabilization function. The core's job in daily life is sustained postural resistance, holding the spine stable against loads that would flex, extend, or rotate it for minutes to hours of continuous activity. Slow-twitch fibers are designed for exactly this duration. Dynamic sit-ups preferentially recruit fast-twitch type 2 motor units, fibers designed for rapid force production and quick fatigue, suited for explosive movement the core rarely needs to produce. The 10-second hold trains the fiber type the spine requires for the function the spine performs. Electromyographic comparison: the curl-up produces 85 to 90% of peak rectus abdominis activation compared to a full sit-up. the same muscle trained to nearly the same activation level. Lumbar compression approximately 1,400 to 1,600 newtons, below the NIOSH threshold by 50%. The curl-up stops at the transition point 30 degrees where the rectus peaks and the psoas has not yet engaged. You feel no transition. The movement feels continuous. The burn in the abdomen continues because the rectus remains active as a stabilizer even after the psoas takes over as the prime mover. The burn masks the transition. You feel abdominal effort throughout the movement, but the force generating the motion shifted from the rectus to the psoas at 30 degrees, and the compression climbed with it. The motion stops before the psoas activates, before the moment arm lengthens, before the compression climbs to 3,400. Curl up achieves comparable rectus activation at reduced spinal compression. Exercise selection can maintain target muscle activation while dramatically reducing spinal loading through range of motion restriction. Axler and McGill confirmed this in Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise. And then, the arithmetic. 50 sit-ups, 170,000 newtons of total daily lumbar compression. 50 curl-ups, 75,000 newtons. A 56% reduction in cumulative compression while maintaining 85 to 90% of the same rectus activation. Same muscle trained, less than half the force on the disc. Zero psoas dominance. Zero flexion under load nucleus shift. McGill's full spine sparing program adds 2 more exercises. The side plank, oblique activation without spinal flexion, training the lateral stabilizers that prevent lateral buckling of the spinal column. The bird dog, contralateral arm and leg extension from the quadruped position, training the multifidus and erector spinae for anti-rotation, the deep stabilizers that prevent the spine from twisting under asymmetric loads. The 3 exercises together train the core in all 3 planes of resistance. The curl-up resists extension in the sagittal plane, the side plank resists lateral flexion in the frontal plane, and the bird dog resists rotation in the transverse plane. Each exercise addresses one plane. Together they create the 3-dimensional stiffness the guy wire system requires. The programming is deliberately simple. Each exercise performed for 6 to 8 repetitions of 10-second holds once daily requires approximately 8 minutes of total training time. The simplicity is intentional. The core stabilization function operates every waking hour, and the training that maintains it should be sustainable daily rather than demanding enough to require recovery days. The programming is simple: 1 set of each exercise, held for 10 seconds per repetition, 6 to 8 repetitions, performed daily. Total time, approximately 8 minutes. Total lumbar compression, approximately 12,000 to 15,000 newtons across all 3 exercises combined, less than the compression from 4 sit-ups. 8 minutes of spine-sparing core training replacing 50 repetitions of a movement that exceeded the industrial safety threshold on every rep. Core's function is anti-movement, preventing the spine from flexing, extending, or rotating under load. The distinction is fundamental and rarely taught. Every sit-up trains the core to produce flexion, shortening the rectus abdominis through its concentric range. The spine needs the core to resist flexion, holding the rectus at a fixed length under tension while external loads attempt to bend the spine forward. Concentric training and isometric resistance are opposite motor patterns. The exercise trained the opposite of what the joint requires. The core is the guy wire system. Sit-ups train the core to produce flexion. The big 3 train the core to resist movement. The exercise was backwards. The arithmetic of the replacement landed differently the morning I performed the curl-up for the first time and felt the same rectus burn at half the compression. One clarification remains. The crunch, the partial sit-up where the shoulders lift approximately 30 degrees from the floor, generates approximately 1,800 to 2,000 newtons, below NIOSH but still loading the disc under flexion, safer per rep. But high-volume crunches at 100 or more per session accumulate flexion cycles that fatigue the posterior annulus through the same Paris law mechanics at a lower per cycle force. Lower force multiplied by higher repetitions can equal the same fatigue damage. The crunch reduced the per rep risk. It preserved the mechanism. The distinction matters. Reducing the force per cycle does not eliminate fatigue damage if the cycle count increases to compensate. If you replaced 50 sit-ups with 150 crunches, reduced the per cycle force by 40%, but tripled the cycle count. potentially producing equivalent or greater cumulative annular fatigue through more cycles at a lower but still damaging force level. The mathematics of fatigue is cumulative. Lower force multiplied by higher repetitions does not automatically produce a safer total. The mathematics of cumulative fatigue is indifferent to the per-cycle force below the threshold. What matters is the total energy delivered to the posterior annulus across all cycles, and that total can be equal or greater at lower per-cycle forces if the cycle count compensates. The McGill curl-up eliminates the mechanism entirely, 15 to 20 degrees of flexion, hands preserving lordosis, no posterior nucleus shift, no flexion under load. Whether your current exercise program should be modified, whether your back symptoms relate to your sit-up history, and what replacement protocol is appropriate for your specific situation is a conversation with your physiotherapist or physician. The physics teaches what the exercise does to the disc. The clinician determines what your specific spine requires. If you have been performing sit-ups daily for years and have not experienced back pain, the absence of symptoms does not confirm the absence of fatigue damage. Annular delamination progresses below the pain threshold for years before the breach occurs. The Paris law mechanics run silently. The absence of pain during the accumulation phase is expected, because the annular damage produces no symptoms until the nucleus migrates far enough to contact a nerve root or the inflammatory response to the breach reaches the neural structures. The damage accumulates silently across years of loading. The symptom arrives later, often attributed to the specific event that completed the fracture, rather than the years of cyclic loading that propagated it. The sit-up you performed this morning was safe by itself. The question is how many preceded it. 3,400 exceeds 3,300. The exercise exceeded the limit on every rep. The replacement produces the same abdominal activation at half the compression through a movement that avoids the mechanism entirely. 8 minutes replaces 50 repetitions. The core trains better. The disc survives.